Hey everyone, tonight we embark on a journey that smells faintly of frankincense and salt spray, a historical deep dive into an expedition so critical, so lavish, and so successful that its chief prizes remain catalogued, yet utterly unlocatable today. Imagine, if you will, the bustling harbor of an ancient port, not Rome. Not Athens, but a forgotten sun-bleached inlet on the Red Sea. You stand there, squinting against the glare, the air thick with the noise of wooden mallets and the shouts of thousands of laborers. The massive flat-bottomed ships are being loaded. These aren't just supply runs. These are state-sponsored, high-stakes treasure hunts heading toward a fabled land known only as Punt. This is where the perfume of the gods came from, where the Egyptian elite sourced the oils and resins that literally defined their afterlife, and where pharaohs bought luxuries so exclusive they were, by their very nature, designed to vanish. You're about to follow their wake, sailing into a time when a successful maritime trip could mean the difference between a golden age and a religious collapse. Just picture yourself trying to sleep on a crowded, unrefrigerated boat for weeks, relying on fermented beer and tough flatbread, knowing that if you fall overboard, the local fauna is far less worried about manners than you are. You probably wouldn't survive this journey. It was grueling, dangerous, and reserved only for the toughest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or at least the start of the documented obsession, begins long before the famed Queen Hatshepsut with the 5th dynasty, Pharaoh Sahir. Around 2450 BCE, are living in an Egypt that is powerful, organized, but perpetually thirsty for the exotic. Sahir is often credited with launching the first documented maritime expedition to Punt. Why? Because the land of Punt, which the Egyptians revered as Tanetcher. The land of the god was the only source for the purest, most aromatic myrrh and frankincense resins. These weren't just nice-smelling candles. These were non-negotiable necessities for the cult of the sun god, Yemen, for the elaborate mummification process that guaranteed a pharaoh's immortality. To run out of incense was not just an inconvenience, it was a cosmic catastrophe. Imagine the cost-benefit analysis. Sahir scribes risk massive investment in building ships, and crews navigate the unpredictable Red Sea, traverse hostile territories, and secure the divine resins. Absolutely, yes. The spiritual returns outweighed any mortal cost. These early expeditions, though less grand than the later ones, established the logistical groundwork. They figured out where the ports were, how to handle the monsoon winds, and crucially, what kind of currency, usually gold, copper, and manufactured goods like fine linens, the Puntites demanded in exchange. Now, a fun, slightly quirky detail that shows just how thorough they were. Egyptian temple records often list provisions for these voyages. Besides the obvious dried fish and water, they often packed enormous amounts of unguents and oils. Why? Because the harsh Red Sea sun was brutal, and a well-oiled body was a necessity for survival, a bit like ancient, slightly perfumed sunscreen. Historians still argue whether the earliest Puntite trade was strictly maritime or if much of the route was actually overland, following the ancient desert tracks established by nomadic tribes before the ships became the primary focus. The sheer scale of the operation suggests that, by Sahir's time, a dependable sea route was already preferred, minimizing the risk of desert banditry and maximizing payload capacity. Think about the material culture this trade supported. Gold from Nubia supplied the wealth, but the aromatics from Punt supplied the spiritual validation. Without the scent of Punt, the temples would be hollow, the gods dissatisfied, and the pharaoh's passage into the afterlife jeopardized. The items they brought back: ebony, leopard skins, baboons, and, yes, the precious resins were not simply commodities. They were physical proof of the pharaoh's power to control the known and perhaps even the unknown world. The first documented haul under Sahir, recorded in stone at his mortuary temple, listed an impressive array of incense and wood. But the subtle, frustrating aspect is that even these early lists contain vague terms for specific resins or alloys that we can only guess at today. These were the high-fashion items of the era, the equivalent of a modern couture handbag or a bespoke watch butt for the gods. And, like any exclusive item, Once they were used, they were gone forever, often literally going up in smoke in front of the divine statues. The stage is set for a persistent, multi-generational need that will eventually push one queen to launch the most legendary voyage of all. You are now a sailor under Sahir, navigating a landscape where survival relies entirely on the ingenuity of your boatwrights and the guidance of the stars, not some app on your wrist. Sahir's risky sea voyage was less a leisurely cruise and more a terrifying gamble against the elements. Picture yourself stepping onto one of those early 5th Dynasty vessels. They are long, narrow, and often constructed from cedar, imported from Byblos, a costly material in itself. These ships were designed for river travel, but modified for the open, salty hostility of the Red Sea. They lacked deep keels, meaning they were incredibly susceptible to capsizing in rough waters. And their primary means of propulsion was a huge, square sail, requiring constant manual adjustments by a sweating, exhausted crew. This isn't high-tech navigation, it's brute force sailing. Consider the logistics. You need enough water and provisions for a round trip of perhaps 4 to 6 months. Storing fresh water in porous clay jars is a fool's errand. Most of the liquid will evaporate or spoil. Instead, the crew relies heavily on stored, beer-thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic, which surprisingly lasts longer and is less prone to bacterial contamination than standing water. Imagine drinking warm, soupy beer for weeks on end, trying to stay hydrated under the relentless equatorial sun. You constantly worry about the wood planks swelling and shrinking, threatening the integrity of the hull. The constant bailout procedure is part of the daily rhythm. The Red Sea itself presents a maritime nightmare. It's narrow, meaning currents can be vicious, and coral reefs lie hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to tear the bottom out of your fragile wooden hull. Furthermore, the wind patterns are tricky. During parts of the year, the prevailing winds blow north, making the southbound journey to Punt relatively easy, but guaranteeing a grueling, months-long struggle on the return trip, forcing the crew to row constantly or tack laboriously against the wind. This is why the timing of the expedition was absolutely crucial, a calculation made by priests and astrologers as much as by captains. Historians still argue whether the early Egyptian sailors possessed sufficient astronomical knowledge to navigate reliably out of sight of land for prolonged periods, or if they were largely hugging the coastline, which increases the risk of shipwreck on rocky shores. Given the lack of reliable charts, keeping the coastline in sight was probably the safer, if longer, bet. The fringe tidbit here involves the preparation of the cruise. Before leaving, the sailors were subjected to rigorous purification rites. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about appeasing the sea gods and ensuring the expedition's success. You, as a sailor, would be ritually shaved, oiled, and blessed, often carrying small protective amulets. The journey was so perilous that it was viewed almost as a religious sacrifice, and the crew members were considered temporary spiritual warriors. Think of it, you're doing hard labor, smelling of sour beer and sweat, yet you are also walking under a divine contract. The mainstream historical fact is that the port of departure for many of these expeditions was likely Wadi Gavassi's ancient Saw, located far south of the Nile Delta on the Red Sea coast. Excavations at Wadi Gavassi's have revealed actual planks of ship timber, stone anchors, and caches of storage jars dating back to this early era. This site confirms that the Egyptians didn't sail all the way from the Nile. They constructed, or at least substantially fitted, the massive ships at this remote, inconvenient desert outpost. This means the components, the wood, the tools, the copper fastenings had to be hauled overland across the eastern desert first, adding an immense, often overlooked layer of logistical complexity. Imagine hauling a Teuton ship plank across 80 miles of scorching sand dunes. It makes a modern-day road trip with a flat tire seem like a spa retreat. These early voyages, like Sahir's, established the precedent. The gods demanded Punt's products, and the pharaoh would move mountains, or in this case, sail an impossibly long and dangerous sea to acquire them. The success of Sahir's return, though modest compared to later glories, cemented the necessity of the punt trade. It proved that the journey, while terrible, was possible, and every successful return, every jar of fragrant myrrh unloaded, only fueled the desire for the next, even more ambitious trip. This generational effort eventually leads us to the New Kingdom, where the demand for exotic goods transforms from a supply mission into a political and theological declaration of power, culminating in the reign of a queen who refused to be told what was impossible. The necessity established by Sahir now blossoms into an outright obsession, driven by one of Egypt's most formidable rulers, Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty. You are no longer sailing with the Old Kingdom sailors. You are living in the New Kingdom, an era of unprecedented imperial wealth and ambition, circa 1477 BCE. Hatshepsut's commitment to the punch trade was not just about securing supplies, it was an act of theological self-justification. As a female pharaoh in a patriarchal system, she had to constantly prove her divine right to rule. What better way than to declare that the great sun god Amen himself commanded the expedition to the land of the god? Think of her dilemma. She has seized the throne, sidelining her young stepson, Thutmose III. She can't just rule, she must redefine kingship. She claims divine birth, asserts her direct lineage from Amen, and then she orchestrates the grandest, best-documented expedition to Punt in Egyptian history. It wasn't just a trade mission, it was a highly publicized and meticulously recorded propaganda tour designed to demonstrate her piety, her economic power, and her ability to fulfill divine mandate. The fringe tidbit here is her personal connection to the aromatics. Hatshepsut was not just commissioning the trade, she was a consumer and, arguably, a connoisseur. She used the resins to create the most expensive perfumes and cosmetics of the era. Archaeological finds have even suggested she might have used one of her signature ointments, possibly laced with toxic ingredients, leading to chronic skin irritation or worse. The myrrh and frankincense weren't just for the temples. They were used in huge quantities for personal adornment and to mask the pervasive odors of the ancient city. She literally wanted to smell like the gods. Historians still argue whether the scale of Hatshepsut's expedition was truly unique, or if previous pharaohs simply failed to record their voyages with such dazzling, permanent grandeur. Given the detail she provided, it is clear she intended this venture to be her signature maritime achievement, a historical footnote in stone for all eternity. Her motivation stems directly from the cult of Amen, which had risen to incredible power during the New Kingdom. The chief priests needed unlimited supplies of the sacred resins to burn on their altars every hour of every day. This constant olfactory offering was believed to keep Amen happy, and thus keep Egypt prosperous. When Hatshepsut supplied these enormous quantities of incense, she was simultaneously buying the loyalty of the powerful priesthood and proving her legitimacy as the pharaoh chosen by Amen. She was essentially paying for her throne with perfume. You can trace this theological obsession directly to the inscriptions, carved into the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. These scenes, which we will visit next, depict the journey step by step, almost like a comic book for the gods. The texts claim that the oracle of Amen spoke directly, saying, "The ways of Punt shall be brightened for your majesty, and the southern lands shall be flooded with the precious things of the land of the god." This wasn't a suggestion. It was a divine order. The commitment to this trade was so deep that it fueled technological and infrastructural advancements. To move 5 massive ships, the number cited in the records, with their incredible loads of cargo required not just sailors, but an entire industrial complex to support them. We are talking about thousands of workers involved, in everything from ship construction and maintenance to security and overland transport. The divine birth of Hatshepsut's obsession led to a secular, logistical miracle. It required massive capital, political willpower, and the relentless labor of the Egyptian people, all for the sake of securing materials, some of which were so ephemeral, so focused on spiritual consumption, that they literally went up in smoke, leaving no physical trace for you to examine today. This combination of sacred demand and secular execution is what makes the punt trade under Hatshepsut the pinnacle of Egyptian maritime history. You are standing in the Valley of the Kings, but your eyes are fixed not on a tomb, but on the terraces of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. This monumental structure is the heart of our information, the ultimate piece of propaganda detailing the voyage to Punt. Imagine the sunlight baking the white limestone walls, and you can practically hear the chisels singing as the final scenes were immortalized. This temple is an open book, carved into the cliff face, celebrating the divine command, the journey, and the glorious return. You approach the southern colonnade on the middle terrace, which is specifically dedicated to the Punt expedition. What you see is a detailed sequential narrative, the most comprehensive ancient record of a trade mission ever discovered. The reliefs are not just artistic, they are a historical documentary carved in stone, complete with captions. They show the Egyptian ships arriving, the crew making contact, the exchange of goods, and the triumphant departure. They even depict the unique flora and fauna of Punt, including distinctively shaped domed huts built on stilts and the inhabitants themselves. The fringe tidbit that strikes you here is the depiction of the Puntite royal family. Hatshepsut's artists were clearly aiming for exoticism, and their portrayal is often quite exaggerated. The most famous is Queen Hatshepsut, the wife of the local chieftain, Pharaohs. She is shown as remarkably corpulent, with rolls of flesh and a distinct facial structure, probably intended to emphasize her status and the richness of her diet. Some modern scholars speculate that this might be an artistic exaggeration, a caricature to highlight her foreignness, while others believe it is a genuine, if unflattering, portrait of a woman suffering from a condition like steatopygia or elephantiasis. Regardless, her image served Hatshepsut's narrative. Look how powerful we are, dealing with these bizarre yet rich rulers. Historians still argue whether the reliefs depict one single massive expedition or are a composite summary of several successful voyages undertaken during Hatshepsut's reign. The scale and details suggest a primary, highly organized trip, but the perfection of the operation, as portrayed, certainly has the touch of royal editing. Every scene is designed to reinforce the pharaoh's success. The Egyptian sailors look strong and orderly. The Puntites look eager to trade, and the goods are stacked impossibly high. One mainstream historical fact is the sheer volume of live plants shown being transported. The most precious cargo wasn't just the processed resin, but the actual living myrrh trees. The reliefs show Egyptian soldiers carefully digging up the saplings, wrapping the roots in baskets or bundles for transport, and then show them being planted in the temple gardens back in Thebes. This was a critical step toward creating a domestic supply of the sacred incense, an effort to control the source and bypass the need for such dangerous expeditions in the future. Imagine the difficulty of keeping small trees alive on a cramped, salty boat for months. It's a plant nursery manager's nightmare, not a sailor's duty. The way the story glides along the walls is continuous and overwhelming. You see the landing party setting up a temporary campa, scene that includes an Egyptian scribe offering gifts to the Puntites, and the counter scene, where the Puntites bring their lavish goods to the beach, ready for exchange. The message is clear. The relationship was peaceful, mutually beneficial, and conducted under the pharaoh's divine protection. These stones served as the ancient equivalent of a press release, ensuring that any priest, courtier, or visitor would understand the source of the temple's magnificent fragrance and the unrivaled authority of Queen Hatshepsut. The sheer detail, from the types of fish in the water to the specific jewelry worn by the traders, makes the reliefs an unparalleled window into the logistics, diplomacy, and propaganda surrounding the most lucrative trade of the New Kingdom. You realize that everything you are seeing, from the exotic baboons to the sacks of gold, was sourced through that harrowing voyage across the Red Sea, fueled by the relentless demand for the scent of the gods. As you move away from the inscribed propaganda, you must grapple with the logistical reality, the 5 ships and the shipyard miracle. Hatshepsut's fleet was the largest assembled for a single mission to Punt. To outfit 5 massive seaworthy ships required an immense national effort, coordinated by the powerful Chancellor Numat, who oversaw many of the Queen's greatest architectural and economic feats. Think about the sheer amount of raw material needed. The shipbuilding wood, primarily cedar, had to be imported from Lebanon. Already a costly and complex endeavor, then transported down the Nile, across the eastern desert, to the Red Sea port of Wadi Gavassis, which we mentioned earlier. This process was a logistical masterpiece. You're talking about moving hundreds of tons of heavy uncut timber over 70 miles of brutal desert landscape, requiring thousands of laborers to pull sledges in the scorching heat. This makes hauling your old couch up 3 flights of stairs look like a light stretch. The fringe tidbit that underscores the difficulty of this miracle is the construction technique itself. Egyptian shipwrights were masters of shell construction. They didn't build a strong internal skeleton first, like later vessels. Instead, they first pieced together the outer planks of the shell, which were held together not primarily by nails or pegs, but by mortise and tenon joints, tied with rope through drilled holes. This gave the ships flexibility in rough seas, but also required constant maintenance and caulking to provide extra stability for the heavy open sea voyage. The ships required a large, thick rope truss running from bow to stern, tensioned to prevent the ends from sagging. You can imagine the constant groaning tension on this massive cable, the very spine of the ship, as it rode the waves. The historical fact is the incredible effort required after construction, the launching and provisioning. These ships, probably between 70 and 80 feet long, had a shallow draft suitable for beaching, but once loaded with crew, water, trading goods, copper tools, weapons, jewelry, linen, and ballast, they were dangerously heavy. Provisioning included enough food and, crucially, enough water and beer for hundreds of men for months. Each vessel carried between 200 and 300 crew members, including sailors, marines for security, scribes, and priests. That's perhaps 1,000 individuals relying on 5 wooden vessels to transport them and, more importantly, bring back the treasury of Punt. Historians still argue whether the vessels depicted in the Deir el-Bahari reliefs are true-to-life representations of the vessels used in the open ocean, or if the artists idealized their proportions and rigging. The shallow draft shown in the reliefs would be great for beaching in Punt, but terrifying in a Red Sea gale. The reality is probably a blend, strong enough to survive the trip, but fragile enough that every day at sea was a calculated risk. The shipyard itself, at Wadi Gavassis, was a temporary industrial center, a marvel of temporary engineering. It existed solely to serve the punt trade. You would see copper workers forging tools, rope makers twisting flax into heavy cables, and scribes meticulously inventorying every single item loaded. Every detail was accounted for, down to the last jar of beer and the last piece of trade jewelry. This wasn't a casual shopping trip. It was a state-run, federally funded high-risk acquisition mission. The success of the journey hinged on the integrity of the 5 ships, a feat of engineering that took months, if not years, of preparation, and ultimately served to prove that Hatshepsut could command not just her court, but the very materials of the earth, bending cedar from Lebanon into vessels that would cross a vast, dangerous sea for the glory of Ammon. The next step is to actually get these fragile wooden boxes of treasure across the water. With the magnificent fleet launched at Wadi Gavassis, you are now on the deck of one of Hatshepsut's vessels, navigating the treacherous Red Sea coasts. The exhilaration of departure quickly fades into the reality of a weeks-long struggle. You trudge the deck, feeling the hull groan beneath you, surrounded by the smell of salt, sweat, and the ever-present sour mash of the sailor's beer. The Red Sea is known for its unforgiving nature, and your journey is plagued by constant, immediate dangers. Firstly, the weather patterns are notoriously erratic. While you aim to sail during the time of year when the northerly winds are manageable, sudden violent squalls can whip up, turning the relatively shallow sea into a churning mess, capable of snapping masts and ripping sails. As the ship is heavily laden with provisions and trade goods, it handles poorly, making these unexpected storms terrifying moments when survival depends entirely on the crew's synchronized effort to manage the massive steering oar and reef the sail. A mainstream historical fact is the threat posed by the coastline itself. Unlike the smooth sailing of the Nile, the Red Sea is littered with hidden coral reefs and rocky outcrops. Because these vessels had no reliable charts, navigation was a constant, nerve-wracking process of sounding the depths and relying on the sharp eyes of the lookout. A single misjudgment in a shallow area could tear a hole in the hull, leading to a catastrophic loss of life, and worse for the Pharaoh, the cargo. This is why hugging the coastline was often necessary, despite the increased risk of encountering unwelcoming communities. The fringe tidbit that complicates your voyage is the existence of pirate-like communities along the route. Though the Egyptian fleet was accompanied by marines, small, opportunistic groups of coastal inhabitants would sometimes attack supply boats or isolated members of the expedition. These skirmishes, though rarely mentioned in the triumphalist Egyptian records, were a constant low-level threat, forcing the crew to maintain a vigilant watch even when anchored for the night. You are not just fighting nature, you are fighting hostile humanity in its harshest environment. Water is your constant worry. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. You need fresh water, and the only way to get it is to stop frequently at known coastal watering holes, often just brackish springs or temporary oases. These stops are necessary but dangerous, as they expose the crew to potential ambushes and delay the overall mission. The management of the limited water supply is paramount. Every drop is rationed, leading to a state of perpetual thirst that wears down the crew's morale and physical stamina. You might crack a light joke about how the crew would rather face a sea monster than drink the water at some of these stops, but the danger is real. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used the dangerous but faster open sea route across the central Red Sea, or if they strictly relied on the slower but safer coastal route, stopping frequently for supplies. The massive scale of Hatshepsut's fleet suggests they might have been confident enough to take the more direct central route for some sections, relying on their numbers and the Marines for protection. But the fragility of the ships argues for sticking close to the shore. Every time the massive square sail catches the wind, you feel a jolt of hope, but every night, when you drop anchor in a questionable cove, the tension returns. This whole operation is a testament to the Pharaohs' political will overriding common sense. They endure this brutal long-distance ordeal simply because the luxurious, intangible goods waiting at the end, the incense, the oils, the fragrant resins, were considered essential for the continuation of Egyptian civilization itself. Without the scent of the gods, the entire religious and political structure would crumble, making every backbreaking mile on this ship a necessary sacrifice. After weeks of battling the Red Sea's currents and avoiding rogue communities, you finally approach the moment of truth, the enigma of Punt. Where did the ships land? You are gazing out from the deck, searching for the telltale signs, the domed huts, the specific floor-off that the Egyptian pilots, relying on generations of accumulated knowledge, are watching for. The location of Punt is perhaps the most famous and most frustrating scholarly debate connected to this entire historical deep dive. It is the core geographical mystery. The Egyptian records are meticulous in describing the goods procured, but frustratingly vague when it comes to precise latitude and longitude. They refer to it as the land wheresoever is the farthest limit of the sky, which is poetically unhelpful for navigation. The mainstream consensus has long placed Punt somewhere on the Horn of Africa, specifically the coastlines of modern-day Eritrea, Sudan, or Somalia. This theory is supported by the catalog of goods, myrrh, frankincense, ebony, and exotic animals like giraffes, baboons, and leopards, which are indigenous to that region. Furthermore, the discovery of Egyptian anchors and inscribed timber at the Red Sea port of Wadi Gavassis provides physical evidence that the journey was indeed a maritime one heading south along the African coast. The theory suggests the landing was somewhere between Port Sudan and perhaps Djibouti. However, the fringe tidbit involves a persistent, compelling counterargument that places Punt across the sea on the Arabian Peninsula, possibly in the area of modern Yemen or even Oman. The rationale here is based on the superior quality of the boswellia and commiphora trees, the sources of frankincense and myrrh found in southern Arabia, which are still the world's finest. Additionally, some scholars argue that the ships, relying heavily on northerly winds to return, might have been easier to maneuver across the narrower strait than to sail laboriously against the wind along the entire African coast. Historians still argue whether the natural resources and ethnic descriptions found in the Egyptian reliefs more strongly match the ecology of the African coastline or the Arabian coast. Imagine the captain's relief as he finally gives the order to drop anchor. The location, wherever it is clearly a functioning known trade hub, not some newly discovered wilderness. The Egyptians had a relationship with this place, suggesting a degree of diplomatic continuity over centuries. The fact that the Puntites knew exactly what the Egyptians would bring: copper, tools, jewelry, and exactly what they demanded: resins. Gold timber indicates a highly structured, recurring system of exchange. The environment you see is dramatically different from the Nile Valley. The air is drier, perhaps more mountainous, and the vegetation is dominated by the stunted, gnarled myrrh and frankincense trees, which look like something you might joke is a bush that accidentally sat on a fence and got stuck. The difference is the smell. Even before you step ashore, the breeze carries the intense, heavy, sweet aroma of resin that has defined your entire journey. The importance of the precise location isn't just academic. It affects our understanding of ancient trade routes and shipbuilding capabilities. If Punt was located in the Arabian Peninsula, it implies the Egyptian fleet was capable of and willing to make a high-stakes open ocean crossing. If it was on the African coast, it highlights the mastery of coastal navigation over extreme distances. In either case, it confirms the immense distance traveled for goods that were highly perishable or inherently intangible once used. the very luxuries nobody can locate today because they were consumed by fire. This long, arduous journey underscores the extreme value placed on that sweet, smoky scent of the divine. After the endless weeks at sea, you are finally there. The arrival, smoke, sounds, and the smell of trade. As the Egyptian ships beach their shallow drafts on the sandy shore of Punt, the sensory experience is overwhelming. The air is thick, not just with salt and sweat, but with the heady, pervasive aroma of myrrh and frankincense, resin's very smell that has driven this 1,000 sophiles voyage. It's the scent of the sacred, mixed with the mundane odors of cooking fires and drying fish. You step ashore, a marine escort marching at your side, and the first thing that strikes you is the sound. Not the cacophony of a large Egyptian city, but a blend of foreign voices, the bleating of livestock, and the calls of exotic birds you've never heard before. The Egyptian contingent, led by the Pharaoh's chief steward, sets up a temporary, fortified encampment. They bring with them the gifts and goods for exchange: copper tools, bronze weapons, fine linens, manufactured jewelry, and, critically, food items like bread and beer, which served as both sustenance and tokens of diplomatic goodwill. A mainstream historical fact detailed in the Deir el-Bahari reliefs is the initial diplomatic contact. The Puntite chief Pharaoh and his wife Queen Hatshepsut are shown advancing to meet the Egyptians. The text accompanying the scene records the Puntites exclaiming with wonder, "How have you reached this place, a place which the people of Egypt know not? Did you descend from the ways of the sky? Did you travel upon the water?" This dialogue, whether literal or dramatic flourish, emphasizes the remoteness of Punt and the audacity of the Egyptian voyage. The fringe tidbit is the nature of the Puntite dwellings. The reliefs show the inhabitants living in distinct domed huts raised on poles, a structure unique in Egyptian art and perfectly adapted to a marshy or flood-prone coastal environment. This detail suggests that the Egyptians were keen observers and recorded the truly alien aspects of this land. They weren't just trading, they were conducting an ethnographic study in stone. Imagine the cultural shock. You've traveled from the orderly limestone architecture of the Nile to a village of thatched wood homes elevated off the ground. Historians still argue whether the trade was conducted directly by the local Puntite inhabitants, or if the site was a major transshipment hub, where goods gathered from the deep interior of Africa and Arabia were consolidated for maritime export. Given the vast range of goods from African fauna to specific Arabian resources, it's highly probable that the Egyptians were dealing with intermediaries who had their own complex internal trade networks, making this beachhead less a village and more a sophisticated, albeit temporary, international marketplace. The exchange is peaceful and meticulous. Scribes from both sides carefully record the transactions. The Puntites are eager for Egyptian metalwork and manufactured items, goods they likely couldn't produce themselves, while the Egyptians are single-mindedly focused on the aromatics. You see mounds of resin piled high, glistening in the sun, waiting to be weighed and packed. The first sight of the live myrrh trees is also documented. They are already dug up and temporarily potted or bundled, ready for the most delicate part of the cargo operation. The sheer volume of goods being exchanged quickly transforms the quiet beach into a bustling bazaar. The air is electric with the success of the mission, the potential for immense profit and glory, and the palpable fulfillment of the Pharaoh's divine command. This moment, the convergence of two distinct ancient civilizations, driven by the Egyptian need for intangible luxuries sent to appease their goddess, the pinnacle of the entire voyage, proving that Hatshepsut's reach truly extended to the farthest limits of the known world. Stepping back from the diplomatic bustle on the beach, you are now focused on the mountains of treasure being amassed. Puntite riches, ebony, gold, and the myrrh trees. The Egyptian record keepers are working frantically, documenting every exchange, and you realize the haul is not just massive, it's transformative for the Egyptian economy, and more importantly, its religious life. The mainstream goods, the ones that anchor the trade and make the voyage economically viable, are impressive. First and foremost is the incense. Huge quantities of myrrh and frankincense resin, carefully scraped from the trees and packed into large sacks or baskets. These fragrant resins are the core of the mission, essential for the daily rituals in the temples of Amen, Osiris, and every other major deity. Then there is ebony, referred to in Egyptian texts as Kam. This dense, dark wood, prized for its strength and aesthetic quality, was used for the most luxurious items: furniture, caskets, and ritual objects. It symbolized wealth and permanence. A fringe tidbit relating to the ebony is the likely involvement of different regional sources. While Punt itself may have been the port for ebony, the wood itself often originated from deep in the African interior, transported by various tribal networks to the coast. This suggests the Egyptian presence was tapping into a vast, established continental trade route stretching far beyond the coastline where the ships landed. Punt was the gateway, not necessarily the sole producer of every item. You might joke that the Egyptians were performing ancient long-distance supply chain management, and Hatshepsut was the CEO. Furthermore, the haul included substantial amounts of gold, often referred to as NAB. While Egypt already had gold from Nubia, the gold from Punt seems to have been highly valued, perhaps due to its quality, or perhaps due to its symbolic association with the divine land. Leopard skins, giraffe tails, and, notably, live baboons sacred to the god Thoth, and other exotic fauna were also loaded, destined for the royal zoo or for ritualistic display. Historians still argue whether the Puntites themselves were the primary miners and gatherers of the goods, or whether they were entirely maritime brokers acting as the final point in a long-distance terrestrial trade network. The sheer volume of diverse goods from specific resins to high quality timber suggests a complex, centralized system of collection. But the most delicate cargo, and a profound historical fact, is the live trees. The reliefs show 31 living myrrh saplings successfully transported and planted back in the temple gardens at Deir el-Bahari. This was a truly revolutionary act. It wasn't just acquiring a product, it was acquiring the means of production. The goal was to bypass the dangerous voyage entirely by making the scent of the gods locally sourceable. It's hard enough keeping a houseplant alive, let alone transporting thyrtiplis on an ancient sailboat. As you watch the endless lines of porters carrying the sacks of resin and the logs of ebony, you are struck by the sheer dedication to a supply chain driven by religious demand. These tangible, high-value goods, gold and ebony, made the trip financially justifiable. But it was the aromatics, the resins, and the live trees that gave the expedition its ultimate spiritual purpose. Everything is documented, everything is weighed, and everything is about to be loaded onto the ships for the perilous return voyage. A journey made even riskier by the immense weight of the collected Puntite riches. You now turn your attention to the most tantalizing part of the inventory, the missing ingredient, the unidentified luxury. While the ebony and gold are impressive and the frankincense is essential, the Egyptian records, particularly those relating to the offerings to the gods, are peppered with descriptions of goods that defy modern classification. These are the truly lost luxuries, items mentioned by name but whose material composition or original source remains a genuine scholarly puzzle. Think of the temple inventories. They often list standard items, but then they include terms like SMT and NH. While Nintwai is usually translated as myrrh, some scholars suggest it refers to a particularly rare or superior variety of resin, perhaps a mixture, or even a different aromatic entirely, now extinct or no longer harvested in that region. These were the exclusive high-grade aromatics, possibly blended with oils or animal fats in a specific way that elevated them beyond the common temple incense. The mainstream historical fact is that the Egyptians were masters of material blending and refinement. They didn't just burn raw resin, they processed it into ointments, unguents, and oils for ritual and cosmetic use. The recipes for these complex products were often closely guarded secrets, known only to the temple priests and royal perfumers. Once used smeared on a statue, burned in a censer, or mixed into a funerary shroud, the physical evidence vanishes. This intangible nature is a primary reason why these specific luxuries are lost to us. A fringe tidbit is the mention of certain mysterious metallic alloys, or colored stones, described as coming from Punt. Some texts mention shao and chemstones whose descriptions do not neatly align with known Egyptian minerals like lapis lazuli or turquoise. Could chem have been an early reference to some form of synthesized or heat-treated mineral, perhaps glass or a ceramic glaze that briefly caught the eye of the pharaoh? Or was it an exceptionally rare form of opal or garnet from the African interior? The vagueness suggests a material so exotic it had no parallel in the Egyptian lexicon, forcing the scribes to use vague, descriptive terms. Historians still argue whether these unidentified items represent completely different, now forgotten substances. or simply specialized Egyptian terminology for known materials that possessed unique histatus qualities. For example, a type of copper or with a high silver content might have been given a new exotic name because it came from the land of God. The term that best summarizes this category is perfume of the gods. This refers not just to the smell, but to the entire finished product, the high-grade resins, the rare fixatives, and the specialized containers they were kept in. Imagine a modern, exclusive perfume that relies on a single, secret ingredient sourced from a remote valley. Once the ingredient is exhausted, or the valley is paved over, the luxury item becomes unreproducible, and, eventually, a historical riddle. The core of the mystery is that Hatshepsut and her priests weren't just seeking bulk commodities, they were seeking rarity and uniqueness. The power of a luxury item is often derived from its exclusivity. If everyone could find it, it wouldn't appease a god or validate a queen's rule. The specific unidentified goods from Punt likely represented the pinnacle of this exclusivity, materials so rare that only one successful expedition could secure them, and so religiously valuable that they were consumed almost immediately upon arrival. Like a particularly potent memory, their existence is recorded, but their physical form evaporated into the smoky air of the New Kingdom temples. The trade, as documented at Deir el-Bahari, was as much a diplomatic exchange as a financial transaction. And it brings us to the royal family of Punt, Chief Pharaoh and Queen Hatshepsut. You watch the official meeting unfold on the shores, seeing the figures who controlled access to the coveted luxuries. The success of the entire Egyptian mission hinged on maintaining a peaceful, beneficial relationship with these rulers. Chief Pharaoh, the leader of Punt, is depicted as a man of average build, adorned with a specific type of goatee and often wearing simple jewelry. He is shown approaching the Egyptians with an air of respect, holding out his hand in welcome. This suggests that he understood the value of the Egyptian trade goods and the importance of maintaining an open route. The Egyptians, ever keen on diplomatic optics, presented gifts first, often elaborate weapons, manufactured goods, and items like the famed bread and beer designed to show off Egyptian civilization and generosity. The fringe tidbit that captures your attention is the highly debated depiction of Queen Hatshepsut, as noted earlier. The reliefs portray her as exceptionally stout, with a body shape radically different from the idealized, slender figures of Egyptian royalty. She is shown alongside her husband, Chief Pharaoh, and a donkey that carried her. This inclusion of a unique physical characteristic raises many questions. Was this a medical condition? Or did this corpulence signify high status and wealth in Puntite society, much like a suntanned complexion was considered low status for Egyptians? It's a fascinating glimpse into an entirely alien standard of beauty and power. Historians still argue whether the exaggerated portrayal of Queen Hatshepsut was based on genuine observation by the Egyptian artists, or if it was a deliberate artistic device intended to subtly caricature the foreigners, reinforcing the idea of Egyptian cultural superiority, even while acknowledging Punt's economic importance. Given the heavily propagandistic nature of the temple reliefs, it's safe to assume a blend of fact and artistic license. A mainstream historical fact is the sophistication of Puntite society. The exchange was not a simple bullying of primitives by a technologically superior civilization. The Puntites had organized leadership, a stable base of operations, and highly valued commodities. They clearly knew the worth of their products, demanding specific and high-quality Egyptian goods in return. This wasn't a one-sided tribute, it was a complex, mutually acknowledged barter system. The Egyptians brought manufactured scarcity metals, textiles. The Puntites supplied natural scarcity resins, exotic timber, gold. Imagine the conversation. The Egyptian emissary, perhaps a seasoned military officer and diplomat, having to carefully negotiate the price of a single live-myrrh sapling with a queen whose appearance alone defies all Egyptian norms. It's a masterful performance of ancient diplomacy, where you have to suppress your own cultural biases for the sake of the Pharaoh's spiritual imperative. The inclusion of the entire royal family in the documentation underscores the importance of this mission. Hatshepsut wasn't dealing with local fishermen. She was dealing with a sovereign power, recognizing their political structure to ensure the stability of the trade. The images of Pharaoh and Hatshepsut, even with their foreignness emphasized, are a necessary acknowledgement of the economic leverage held by the people of Punt. They held the key to the finest incense, and therefore indirectly, the key to the happiness of the great God. Amen. You see here the ultimate irony. The world's greatest power humbling itself on a remote beach to negotiate with foreign monarchs for goods destined to be literally turned into smoke. With the diplomatic exchange concluded, the focus shifts to the most delicate and historically significant part of the cargo operation. Bringing the trees back, the horticultural challenge. You are now witnessing an act of biological imperialism. The effort to permanently relocate a species essential for Egyptian religious life. The mainstream historical fact is the incredible effort dedicated to the safe transport of the live frankincense and myrrh saplings. The Deir el-Bahari reliefs show these trees carefully dug up, with their root balls wrapped in baskets or cloth bundles to retain moisture and soil. The commitment was revolutionary. Egyptians were not content just to buy the harvested product. They wanted to control the source. This single act highlights the strategic thinking of Hatshepsut's administration, securing a long-term domestic supply to reduce reliance on the perilous and expensive punt voyages. Imagine the logistical puzzle. You have over 30 delicate trees on a wooden ship designed primarily for bulk cargo and human transport. These plants are native to a hot, dry, often rocky environment. On the crowded deck, they face a host of dangers. The constant spray of salt water, which is lethal to most terrestrial plants. The risk of being crushed or damaged during rough seas, and the constant need for fresh water, which, as we noted, was rationed even for the sailors. You might joke that the chief horticulturist on the voyage had the highest stress job. Trying to keep a garden alive in the middle of a massive maritime haul. The fringe tidbit that adds complexity to this challenge is the specific requirement of the tree's environment. Frankincense and myrrh trees thrive on marginal soils and require highly specific, often harsh, drainage conditions. Simply planting them in the rich silt of the Nile Valley would likely drown them. The Egyptians, therefore, had to create special raised planters or artificial dry habitats in the temple grounds at Deir el-Bahari, mimicking the rocky, arid terrain of Punt. This specialized gardening knowledge must have been acquired through close observation while in Punt, or perhaps through detailed instruction from the Puntite locals. Historians still argue whether the trees successfully established a self-sustaining population that lasted for generations in Egypt, or if they were merely cultivated for a single pharaoh's reign as a powerful symbol. We know they were planted and thrived for a time, contributing to the famous myrrh terrace at Hatshepsut's temple, transforming the austere temple grounds into a fragrant, living tribute to Amun. The return voyage, therefore, became a dual mission: bring back the gold and resin for the present, and bring back the live trees for the future. The live cargo would have necessitated unique onboard arrangements, perhaps involving daily ritual watering and sheltering, treating the trees not as cargo but as precious diplomatic passengers. This required dedicating significant manpower and resources, proving just how non-negotiable the scent of the gods was to the pharaoh. The successful transport and planting of these trees stands as an ancient testament to ambition, logistics, and the power of religious demand to overcome immense natural obstacles, ensuring that the essence of Punt could reside permanently within the heart of Egypt. As the precious cargo is secured, both the living trees and the massive quantities of harvested resin, you realize the ultimate destination and purpose of these goods: the sacred ointments and the cult of Amun. The success of the Punt mission was measured not in profit, but in the appeasement of the chief state god. Every sack of myrrh and every crystal of frankincense was a direct contribution to the operational necessities of the massive temple complex at Karnak and the mortuary cult of the pharaoh. The mainstream historical fact is the sheer consumption rate of aromatics by the Amun priesthood. The daily temple ritual was an elaborate multi-stage affair that required copious amounts of incense. Statues of the gods were ritually awakened, washed, dressed, and critically anointed with fragrant oils and passed through the smoke of burning resins. This continuous olfactory offering was not optional. It was believed that the smoke carried the prayers of humanity up to the divine world, and conversely, ensured the gods' presence and benevolence on earth. A lack of high-quality incense was equivalent to cutting off communication with the cosmos. Imagine the high priest standing before the sealed sanctuary, the air heavy with anticipation. The scent of Punt was the smell of divinity. The priests used specific high-grade oils and unguents for anointing the divine image. These were often complex blends of plant oils, like moringa or castor oil mixed with the purest myrrh and frankincense. These mixtures were the sacred ointments, ephemeral products that were consumed by use, leaving no trace for you to study today. The fringe tidbit that highlights the value of these resins is their role in mummification. The Egyptians believed that the scent of myrrh possessed purifying and even regenerative properties, linking it to the eternal cycle of life and death, and particularly the god Osiris. Myrrh and frankincense were essential components in the embalming process, not just for their pleasant aroma, but because their chemical properties helped to draw moisture out of the body and preserve the tissues. This dual, used purifying the living god statue and preserving the dead, Pharaoh made them doubly indispensable. Historians still argue whether the resins were always used in their purest form, or if the Egyptians had developed methods of chemically modifying or synthesizing their aroma through blending with local materials, thereby stretching the supply of the expensive puntite import. Given their chemical ingenuity in other areas, some form of adulteration or enhancement is likely, though the He-grade pure resin remained the pinnacle offering. The great irony of the Punt expeditions is that they were incredibly costly in ships, lives, and resources, all for items that were literally intended to be consumed by fire or friction. The gold and ebony were tangible, permanent assets, but the resins and oils, the spiritual heart of the mission, were designed to disappear. When Hatshepsut claimed that the expedition made the Temple of Ammon fragrant with the scents of Punt, it was a literal, sensory claim. She was providing the material substance for the god's daily existence. The expedition was therefore an investment in religious solvency, ensuring that the state's relationship with the gods remained strong, guaranteeing the stability of her reign. Every successful return of a Punt vessel was a political victory, a divine endorsement secured through the power of perfume. Beyond the fragrant resins, the manifests from Punt also included metals, leading us to investigate the mystery of the electrum, lost gold, or unknown alloy. The Egyptian desire for precious metals was relentless, and while much of their gold came from Nubia, Punt supplied something different, something often referred to in the temple texts. The mainstream historical fact is that electrum was a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. It was found in Egyptian gold mines and was known for its pale yellow to white color. The Egyptians valued it highly, using it for everything from decorative caps on obelisks to the creation of sacred religious objects. If the metal coming from Punt was simply naturally occurring electrum, why would it be specifically noted as a unique import from the land of the god? The fringe tidbit centers on the possibility that the electrum from Punt was either a superior quality natural alloy with a unique proportion of gold to silver, or that the Puntites had the ability to deliberately create a refined composite metal, which the Egyptians could not replicate. The Egyptians were very skilled metal workers, but if Punt offered an alloy with specific, desirable physical properties, perhaps a unique malleability or a specific pale luster that symbolized the moon or certain celestial badazet, would be highly prized and named as a unique import. Imagine a modern metallurgist discovering an alloy with properties nobody else can replicate. That's the kind of value this metal would possess. Historians still argue whether the reference to electrum from Punt always meant the gold-silver alloy, or if the term was sometimes used as a generic high-status term for any pale gold or white gold-like metal arriving from the remote southern lands. Given the vagueness of many of the lost luxury terms, it's possible that the scribes were struggling to name a precious metal. That was new to their experience, perhaps even an alloy containing trace amounts of platinum or another hidden city metal. The importance of the metal wasn't just its economic value, it was its symbolic power. In Egyptian theology, gold was the flesh of the gods. Pale gold, or electrum, was often associated with solar and lunar symbolism, representing the pure, incorruptible substance of the cosmos. By securing this specific electrum of Punt, Hatshepsut was not just enriching her treasury, she was securing a material that held significant religious meaning, allowing her to build monuments and ritual objects of unparalleled divine purity. You see here the pattern. The exotic nature of the goods is directly proportional to their spiritual status. The difficulty in locating this luxury today is twofold. First, electrum is almost always melted down and reused, meaning its original source cannot be chemically traced to Punt. Second, the term itself is ambiguous, dissolving the specific item into a general category. Like many of the intangible or consumable luxuries we've discussed, The electrum of Punt may have been special due to a unique characteristic that was valued in the 15th century BCE, but whose specific nature is now lost to time, overshadowed by the more easily traceable gold and silver found elsewhere. You realize that sometimes the true value of an ancient luxury was simply its story, the fact that it came from the mythical land of the god. Moving on from the precious metals, your focus shifts to another core commodity of the Punt trade, the unique timber. We now examine the black wood riddle. Is it ebony or something rarer? The logs of wood brought back from Punt were essential for creating the elite furniture, inlays, and ritual objects that symbolized pharaonic power. The mainstream historical fact is that the most commonly imported black wood was ebony kam. This is a dense black hardwood sourced from various Diospyros species, mainly found in the tropical regions of Africa, fitting the likely location of Punt. Egyptian craftsmen highly prized it for its smooth finish and resistance to pests, using it in conjunction with gold and ivory to create stunning high-contrast pieces of furniture found in royal tombs. However, the records sometimes refer to different types of black wood or woods with unusual coloration. The fringe tidbit here is the possibility that the Egyptians were importing another no-vanished or extremely rare species. Was there a type of African blackwood dalbergia, melanoxylon, or another dense tropical wood that was so heavily exploited for the Egyptian market during the New Kingdom that the specific variety was driven to commercial extinction in the easily accessible coastal regions of Punt? The relentless demand for this luxury timber, driven by the royal workshops, might have depleted the best stands near the trading ports, leaving behind only the more common varieties. Historians still argue whether the different names for black wood found in the Egyptian inventories refer to entirely separate species, or simply different grades and qualities of the same ebony wood. For example, the dense heartwood might have one name, and the less desirable sapwood another, even though they came from the same tree. A higher grade of ebony, perhaps a piece large enough for a massive statue, would be priced and named differently than smaller pieces destined for veneer. You might think of it as comparing a fine Italian leather briefcase to a cheap imitation they both leather, but the quality and name are miles apart. The logistical scale required to move this heavy timber is a key historical fact. Large, straight logs of ebony were highly valued because they were structurally necessary for certain high-status items. Loading these massive logs onto the ships, which were already dangerously overloaded with myrrh, gold, and live animals, was a feat of strength and engineering. The ships are depicted returning dangerously laden, their shallow hulls hugging the water, suggesting the captains took enormous risks for the sake of the pharaoh's demands. Like the mystery alloy, the rarer black wood of Punt remains elusive, primarily because wood is organic and susceptible to decay, and the finest pieces were often integrated into larger composite artifacts. When you look at an ebony cabinet today, you can admire the material, but you cannot chemically trace its specific origin or determine if it came from a species that was unique to the land of the god. It is another luxury that, while physically present, has lost its precise historical identity, melting into the general category of valuable tropical hardwood, due to the vagueness of the ancient terminology and the relentless pressure of supply and demand. The ships, now heavily laden with timber, gold, and resin, also carried a very special and lively cargo: the exotic fauna, baboons, leopards, and the lost pet trade. The importation of live animals from Punt was a crucial aspect of the trade, serving both religious functions and highlighting the unparalleled status of the pharaoh. You are watching the animals being carefully loaded, their protests adding to the cacophony of the port. The mainstream historical fact is the religious and political significance of these animals. Foremost among them were the baboons, particularly the Hamadryas baboon, which was revered as a manifestation of the god Thoth, the deity of writing, knowledge, and the moon. Bringing back live baboons from the land of the god was a powerful religious statement, ensuring the flow of divine knowledge and the pharaoh's favor with Thoth. These animals were destined for temple enclosures, where they were ritually cared for. You see, the handlers struggle with the baboons, who are probably not enjoying the cramped conditions of maritime travel. A fringe tidbit is the variety of less well-documented exotic pets that likely made the journey. The reliefs show leopards being brought back, likely destined for the royal zoo or for their skins, which were worn by high-ranking priests as a symbol of their power and proximity to the divine. But some scholars suggest that the texts refer to animals that may be variations or subspecies unique to the region that is now Puntwa. Were they acquiring unique subspecies of monkeys, or perhaps jinnets, or other small spotted predators? This speaks to an ancient high-end pet trade, where the rarity of the animal directly corresponded to the social status of its owner. Imagine showing up to an ancient Theban party with a leopard cub on a leash. You've officially won the night. Historians still argue whether the exotic fauna were acquired through direct purchase from the Puntites, or if the Egyptian expedition included specialized hunters who captured them in the vicinity of the trading post. Given the diplomatic nature of the mission, it is more likely they were traded goods, with the Puntites acting as skilled animal trappers. However, the presence of Marines suggests the expedition was prepared for any eventuality, including the need for a protective perimeter while animal handlers performed their tasks. The sheer difficulty of keeping these animals alive on the multi-month voyage is a historical fact that underscores the commitment that required separate quarters, specific diets, and protection from the harsh elements and the stress of the sea. The successful return of healthy animals was a testament to the meticulous planning and the specialized personnel included in the crew. The fate of these animals, after their arrival, was usually grand either, living a pampered life in a temple or a royal menagerie, or serving as a source of prestigious materials, skins, tails for the elite. These animals were, in a way, another form of the intangible luxury. Their value lay not in their material substance, but in their exotic provenance and the living connection they represented between the pharaoh escort and the mythical land of the god. When you look at the depiction of a baboon in a temple, you're looking at the living, breathing proof of a successful, dangerous expedition, a moving, chattering piece of propaganda that traveled thousands of miles across a hostile sea, all for the validation of the pharaoh's power. With the precious cargo finally secured, the gold, the ebony, the resin, the live trees, and the exotic fauna are now part of the return journey. The triumphant, overloaded vessels. The mood is jubilant, but the physical reality is daunting. The ships are dangerously low in the water, a testament to the success of the mission, but a terrifying reality for the next few months at sea. You are back on the deck, and you can feel the difference immediately. The vessels, designed for river travel and modified for the sea, are now carrying an enormous payload far exceeding their typical river capacity. The shallow draft is a liability. Every swell of the Red Sea threatens to wash over the sides, or worse, destabilize the vessel. The crew constantly struggles to balance the load, making sure that delicate cargo, especially the living trees and the anxious animals, remain secure. The mainstream historical fact is that the return journey was logistically more difficult than the outbound trip due to prevailing winds. During the sailing season, the northerly winds that aided the southbound voyage to Punt become a headwind on the return. This forces the sailors to rely far more heavily on rowing or laboriously tacking sailing zigzag patterns against the wind, transforming the trip into an exhaustive, brutal physical contest. You can see the sheer strain on the oarsmen, their rhythm relentless under the scorching sun, every muscle aching to bring the pharaoh's treasures home. A fringe tidbit regarding the overload is the increased risk of ship structural failure. The heavy logs of ebony and the massive quantity of gold acted as immense stress points on the shell-built hulls. The constant strain from the cargo and the force of the waves meant the ships required almost constant maintenance. Crew members would be assigned shifts to continuously check and retention. The massive hogging trussed the main rope running bow to stern, which acted as a spine to keep the boat from breaking its back. Imagine constantly having to tighten a crucial structural cable on a leaky wooden box full of gold while trying not to fall into the sea. You might think, well, at least if I drown, I'll be surrounded by the scent of the gods. Historians still argue whether the number of ships that successfully returned was truly the full complement of 5, or if some were lost to the perils of the sea or structural failure under the stress of the cargo. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, being propaganda, certainly show a glorious, intact fleet arriving. But the historical risk profile of the journey suggests that losing 1 or 2 vessels would not have been improbable. Yet the mission was deemed a success nonetheless. The pressure on the crew is intense. They are not just sailors. They are the custodians of the religious and economic future of Egypt. Every mile sailed brings the scent of Punt closer to the temples of Thebes, fulfilling the divine command of Amen and justifying Hatshepsut's rule. The success of the journey is so critical that any fear of personal risk is subsumed by the national imperative. The sight of the African coast, even after weeks of sailing, offers little comfort until they finally reach the safe haven of Wadi Gavassis, the starting point, where the next, equally massive logistical hurdle awaits them, getting the treasure from the Red Sea coast across the desert and into the Nile Valley. The ships have finally reached the safe anchorage of Wadi Gavassis, but the journey is far from over. Now begins the immense multi-day labor of the pacing of the porters hauling the goods inland. The transition from maritime transport to overland caravan represents a shift in logistics, involving a completely different set of dangers and physical demands. You stand at the makeshift port, surrounded by thousands of tons of cargo sacks, of resin, heavy logs of ebony, crates of gold, and anxious live animals. All of it must be moved across approximately 70 to 100 miles of brutal, exposed desert to reach the Nile River Valley, where it can finally be loaded onto river barges for the last leg to Thebes. The mainstream historical fact is the sheer scale of the manpower required for this task. The Deir el-Bahari reliefs show long lines of porters carrying the goods. To move the cargo of 5 massive ships, the expedition likely mobilized thousands of civilian and military laborers. Imagine the coordination needed. Water must be constantly supplied to the porters and animals along the route, and military escorts must guard the high-value items like the gold and the delicate living trees against desert banditry. This overland route, though shorter than the sea journey, was arguably more dangerous for the cargo, as it was concentrated and vulnerable. A fringe tidbit concerns the technology used to manage the heaviest items, particularly the ebony logs. While men carried the sacks of resin and lighter goods, the logs and heavy crates of gold likely necessitated the use of sledges-heavy wooden platforms, pulled over the sand by teams of men or oxen. To reduce friction and ease the burden, the path often had to be lubricated with oil or wet mud, much like how the Egyptians moved massive quarry stones. The level of effort required to drag a multi-ton log across shifting sand is truly staggering. It makes your weekly grocery run feel like a stroll in the park. Historians still argue whether the overland route from Wadi Gavassis utilized a single, highly engineered road, or if the porters simply followed the best natural wadis dry riverbeds that offered some protection and access to scarce water points. Given the temporary nature of the expeditions, relying on natural topography was likely more practical than building a permanent paved desert highway. The focus on the pacing of the porters highlights the meticulous organization required. The caravan had to move at a controlled, steady pace, covering several miles a day, with carefully planned stops for rest and supply replenishment. The most delicate cargo, the live myrrh trees, remember them from Section 12, had to be shaded and watered continuously, necessitating a dedicated team of porters and water bearers just for the plants. You watch as the wealth of punt is slowly, painfully extracted from the coastal region, inching its way across the fiery red sands towards the lifeline of Egypt. This final desert crossing is the last major bottleneck. The goods, so close to their final destination, must be secured, protected, and moved efficiently. Only once the cargo is safely loaded onto the Nile barges can the chief steward finally signal the completion of the physical journey and prepare for the triumphant ceremonial arrival. This labor is the unsung reality of ancient luxury. Every fragrant piece of myrrh, every gleaming piece of electrum was first carried on the aching shoulder of a desert porter. The desert crossing is complete, and the wealth of punt has finally reached the Nile River. You are now in Thebes, ready to witness Hatshepsut's glorious parade, presenting the tribute. This is the moment of triumph, the culmination of the massive undertaking, and it is orchestrated as a spectacular public and religious ceremony designed to solidify the Queen's power and divine favor. Imagine the scene. Thebes, the capital of the new kingdom, is already a city of monumental architecture, but today it is transformed into a stage. The cargo, transferred from the desert sledges and porters to massive Nile barges, arrives at the wharves near Karnak or Luxor. The entire court, led by the high priests of Ammon, is assembled. The air is electric, not just with excitement, but with the heavy, leek-sweet scent of freshly arrived myrrh and frankincense, a smell that immediately signals prosperity and divine blessing. The mainstream historical fact is the ritualistic presentation of the goods to the god Amen. Hatshepsut herself, or her representative like Chancellor Senemet, would oversee the formal counting and dedication of the tribute. The Deir el-Bahari reliefs showed this scene with immense detail. Piles of gold and electrum, stacks of ebony logs, baskets of resin, and the various exotic animals, and critically, the live trees. This was not merely an inventory check. It was a religious offering, a tangible delivery on the promise made to the gods. A fringe tidbit is the nature of the public performance surrounding the parade. The spectacle was designed to impress not just the priests, but the common people. The exotic fauna leopards, baboons, and perhaps even a giraffe were paraded through the streets. These animals, never before seen by most Egyptians, served as living proof of the pharaoh's vast reach and control over the mythical land of the god. This was visual, moving propaganda far more effective than any carved inscription, cementing the queen's image as a ruler favored by the cosmos. You might chuckle, imagining the chaos of trying to lead a giraffe through the crowded, narrow streets of ancient Thebes. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh personally participated in every stage of the ceremonies, or if much of the dedication was carried out by proxies and officials to ensure a separation between the grueling logistical reality and the purified divine presentation. Given Hatshepsut's need to project a powerful image, she certainly would have been present for the key, highly visible moments of consecration. The parade's goal was simple: to connect the arduous, dangerous journey directly to the unprecedented wealth and religious legitimacy of the pharaoh. The ebony and gold would fill the royal treasury. But the intangible luxuries, the aromatics, would be taken directly to the temple storage rooms. These resins would immediately be put to use, burned daily, their smoke rising to symbolically sustain Amen. The scene concludes with the successful transplanting of the live myrrh trees into the temple gardens, creating the famous myrrh terrace. This act finalized the integration of Punt into the Egyptian domain, symbolically bringing the land of the god to the banks of the Nile. The entire parade, from the heavily laden barges to the final presentation of the purified goods, was a declaration of economic power and divine endorsement, paid for in sweat, cedar, and the vast, fragrant wealth of Punt. With the parade concluded and the incense safely stored, you now shift your focus from the spectacle to the numbers. The economic impact: how Punt fueled Egyptian power. The successful acquisition of Puntite luxuries translated directly into tangible political, economic, and diplomatic power for Hatshepsut and the entire New Kingdom. The mainstream historical fact is that the influx of Punt's Highland resources significantly transformed the royal treasury. While the gold was immediately valuable as currency and for luxury goods production, the myrrh and frankincense effectively acted as a religious currency. By ensuring the limitless supply of these sacred aromatics, Hatshepsut guaranteed the continued operations and, crucially, the loyalty of the powerful, wealthy priesthood of Amen. This political capital, bought with incense, was arguably more valuable than the gold itself. Think about the concept of scarcity. Before the grand expedition, these goods were rare and expensive, their flow inconsistent. Hatshepsut's success not only broke that scarcity, but created a temporary glut of the most sacred materials. This surplus allowed for the widespread use of aromatics in temples across Egypt, fueling the expansion of temple cults and, indirectly, the influence of the pharaoh who supplied them. The success of the mission became a self-fulfilling prophecy of national prosperity. A fringe tidbit is the influence these imports had on artisan innovation. The influx of high-quality ebony forced royal workshops to push the boundaries of furniture design and inlay work. Similarly, the unique characteristics of the electrum of Punt likely spurred metalworkers to develop new techniques for alloying and casting, striving for perfection in objects destined for divine use. The economic infusion didn't just provide materials, it provided the raw ingredients for an artistic golden age, defining the iconic aesthetic of the 18th dynasty. Historians still argue whether the cost of the entire expedition, including ship construction, provisioning salaries for thousands of men, and the cost of the trade goods, was fully offset by the value of the non-consumable, non-sacred goods, gold and ebony. Or if the primary return on investment was purely in the form of political legitimacy and religious fulfillment, given the high risks and costs, the expedition was likely viewed as a net political investment, where the spiritual return was incalculable. The economic impact extended to diplomatic clout. Possession of these exotic materials allowed Egypt to engage in gift diplomacy with other powers in the Near East, sending a neighboring ruler a gift of pure Puntite myrrh, an item they knew required immense effort and danger to acquire. Was a clear demonstration of Egypt's extensive reach and unparalleled wealth. This solidified Egypt's status as a superpower, maintaining peace through a combination of military strength and economic superiority, fueled by the exotic cargo from the land of the god. Ultimately, Punt didn't just supply luxuries, it supplied the material foundation for Hatshepsut's political narrative. The economic engine of the new kingdom was supercharged by the consistent acquisition of these resources, ensuring that the temples were fragrant, the treasuries were full, and the queen's claim to the throne was divinely justified. The Punt voyages were the ultimate expression of how an ancient empire could leverage the demand for intangible religious necessities to solidify its economic and political control. The glory of Hatshepsut's expeditions was immense, yet they did not last forever. You are now exploring the inevitable question: the decline of Punt voyages. What killed the trade route? Despite the success, the scale and frequency of the grand state-sponsored missions gradually diminished after Hatshepsut's reign, leading to a period where Punt became a distant, almost mythical memory. The mainstream historical fact points to a combination of internal and external pressures. Internally, the most significant factor was the success of the live tree importation. Remember, the myrrh terrace. If the myrrh and frankincense trees successfully established themselves in Egypt, the urgent, non-negotiable need for the dangerous, high-cost maritime expeditions would naturally decrease. Once the core religious demand was met domestically, the incentive to risk 5 massive ships and thousands of lives in the Red Sea diminished substantially. This is a classic case of supply chain control making the risky procurement method obsolete. Externally, political and geopolitical instability played a role. After the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, Egypt became increasingly focused on its core Near Eastern empire, Syria. This strategic shift meant that resources, military personnel, and diplomatic focus were directed north and east, toward managing conflicts and securing traditional land-based trade routes, rather than maintaining the difficult and remote southern maritime route. A fringe tidbit is the possibility of Puntite political change. The Puntites may have grown less interested in the Egyptian trade, perhaps finding more lucrative partners, or suffering from their own internal conflicts that disrupted their ability to gather and consolidate the vast quantities of goods Egypt demanded. If the Puntite leadership like Chief Pharaoh and Queen Hatshepsut was replaced by rulers less inclined to deal with the Egyptians, the entire arrangement could have collapsed, making the destination functionally unreachable. Historians still argue whether the decline was a sudden cessation due to a catastrophic event, like a massive Red Sea storm that decimated a returning fleet, or if it was a gradual, managed phase-out dictated by strategic economic priorities. The evidence suggests a gradual wane, transitioning from massive state voyages to smaller, less documented entrepreneurial trade, which carried less propaganda value and therefore left fewer permanent records. You can observe a clear pattern. When Egypt was at its most secure and had a leader focused on internal validation, like Hatshepsut, the extravagant Punt voyages were launched. As the new kingdom's focus turned outward to military expansion and defense, the trade route became a liability rather than an asset. By the time of the later Ramesside period, Punt was often referenced in hymns and poetic texts, confirming its mythological status as the source of divine wealth. But the physical expeditions had largely ceased. The cost, the danger, and the sheer effort of the Punt missions were only justifiable when the need was absolute and politically crucial. Once the need was mitigated by domestic cultivation and the political focus shifted, the land of the god faded back into the realm of legend, leaving the specific transient luxuries it once supplied to vanish, along with the ships that brought them. As the grand voyages faded, so did the physical trail of the great trading partner. Leading to the lost city of Punt, an archaeological zero-sum game, you are now acting as an archaeologist, surveying the likely coastlines. Armed with the detailed descriptions from Hatshepsut's reliefs, yet finding almost nothing to definitively mark the location of a major recurring trading hub. The mainstream historical fact is the complete lack of an identified Puntite settlement site. despite the clear evidence of a powerful organized society capable of consolidating and trading massive amounts of high-value goods, gold, ebony, and resinous. No excavation has ever definitively uncovered a Puntite city port or large-scale settlement that correlates with the descriptions in the Egyptian records. If Punt was a major trade partner for centuries, where are the temples, the palaces, the durable goods, and the massive waste heaps that accompany any major civilization? This lack of evidence creates the zero-sum game. The more detail the Egyptians provide about Puntite society, their houses on stilts, their rulers, their goods, the more frustrated the modern archaeologist becomes when trying to match those descriptions to physical remains. The absence of a discernible archaeological footprint is a significant puzzle. A fringe tidbit that attempts to solve this puzzle involves the impermanence of their construction. Remember, the reliefs showed their houses were domed huts, raised on poles. This type of construction strongly suggests a people who relied on readily available biodegradable materials, wood thatch, and mud, which would quickly decompose in a humid coastal environment. If the Puntites did not build in stone, unlike the Egyptians who sought permanence, their major settlements could have simply dissolved back into the landscape over millennia. This stands in stark contrast to the eternal monuments of the pharaohs who demanded their name live forever. Historians still argue whether Punt was a single, fixed geopolitical entity with a permanent capital, or if the name referred to a loose confederation of trading polities spread across a vast stretch of coastline. If Punt was not a fixed city but a shifting cultural region, the Egyptian expeditions might have dealt with different leaders and slightly different landing spots over the centuries, making the task of locating a single lost city impossible. Furthermore, the nature of the trade itself explains the lack of Egyptian artifacts in Punt. The Egyptians traded perishable goods, linens, beer, and non-perishable, highly reusable items, copper, bronze, tools, and jewelry. Copper and bronze would have been quickly melted down and refashioned by the Puntites, leaving behind no distinctly Egyptian form. The gold, already a major Puntite export, was not often sent to Puntite. This means there is a low probability of finding a large concentration of distinctly Egyptian markers to identify the exact trading beachhead. The enduring mystery of the lost city of Punt reflects the ephemeral nature of the luxuries it supplied. The intangible aromatics and the fragile biological materials left little behind. What remains is a historical void of civilization that was crucial to Egypt's spiritual and economic life, yet left only a ghost in the archaeological record, existing primarily through the carved propaganda on a pharaoh's temple wall. The journey's success hinged on more than just the ships. It depended on the infrastructure supporting the land routes. You now examine the red lands and the logistics of the desert. The mainstream historical fact is the necessity of establishing a reliable network of supply posts and water sources across this hostile terrain. For the overland leg of the journey, where thousands of porters hauled the Punt cargo, remember the pacing of the porters. These way stations were critical for survival. They had to be regularly provisioned with food, water, and tools, often maintained by small, permanent military detachments or local nomadic tribes employed by the Egyptian state. This desert infrastructure was the logistical backbone of the entire operation. Think of the desert as an active threat, not just an empty space. The logistics involved ensuring that the large amounts of grain and beer needed for the porters reached the remote coast before the ships arrived. This pre-positioning of supplies required an equally massive and difficult logistical effort. Running convoys from the Nile Valley out into the scorching sands, a fringe tidbit is the historical use of desert signaling systems to communicate the exact timing of the ship's arrival and the preparation required for the massive caravan. The Egyptians may have used a relay system of signal fires or semaphore across the high peaks of the eastern desert mountains. Given the necessity of precise timing, the crew needed to be reprovisioned immediately, and the porters needed to be ready. Some form of rapid long-distance communication would have been highly advantageous, far faster than sending a runner. You might joke that Hatshepsut had the ancient equivalent of a desert cell phone network, albeit one that only transmitted smoke. Historians still argue whether the local mining and quarrying activities in the eastern desert, particularly for amethyst, gold, and turquoise, were integrated into the logistics of the Punt expeditions. It is highly plausible that the same infrastructure used to support the miners and protect the trade routes was also leveraged to support the Punt convoys, making the entire Red Lands a unified, strategically managed zone under pharaonic control. You realize that every fragrant piece of myrrh and every shining chunk of electrum that entered Thebes was filtered through this harsh desert system. The Red Lands were a constant test, a barrier that only the most organized and determined state could repeatedly overcome. The logistics of the desert crossing illustrate that the true marvel of the punt trade wasn't just the sailing. It was the ability of the pharaoh to project and sustain massive economic and military power over vast waterless distances. Without this network of reliable supply and security, the riches of Punt would have simply remained stranded on the shores of the Red Sea. Having analyzed the logistics, the economics, and the propaganda, you return to the core mystery of the script, the curse of the intangible. Why perfumes do unlast? The reason we struggle to locate the most prized luxuries of Punt today lies in the very nature of the goods. Themselves, they were designed for consumption and evaporation. The mainstream historical fact is that the most valuable imports were the volatile organic compounds, the resins, spices, and unguents. Myrrh and frankincense, when burned, release highly aromatic smoke. This smoke was the product. The resins were merely the vehicle. Once burned, the material is gone, having served its purpose of pleasing the deity or purifying a space. Unlike gold or stone, which can be reused, these aromatics represented a one-time transaction with the divine. Imagine yourself in a temple chamber. The priest scoops up the granular myrrh, tosses it onto the hot coals, and a billowing cloud of fragrant smoke fills the air. That smoke, the scent of the gods, is the ultimate luxury, yet it is also the most ephemeral. It fulfills its religious function and then disperses into the atmosphere, leaving behind only ash and a faint odor. This explains why, even if millions of tons of resin were imported over centuries, the physical evidence for this trade beyond the stone reliefs is scarce. A fringe tidbit concerns the ointments and oils, the unguents. These were often complex mixtures of animal fats or plant oils, like sesame or castor oil, mixed with the concentrated essences of puntite resins. These oils were smeared onto the statues of gods, the skin of the pharaoh, and the bodies of the deceased. Over time, these organic materials either decompose or absorbed, or are ritually washed away. Even the containers they were kept in, often ceramic or specialized alabaster jars, might remain, but the precious contents are long gone, victims of biodegradation and use. The closest analogy is modern perfume. You cherish a specific, expensive bottle of cologne, but once it's sprayed, the material has vanished. Historians still argue whether the resins were ever used as a material for non-consumable goods, perhaps ground and mixed into paint or mortar, thereby preserving some residue. While there is evidence of limited use in paint binders, the vast majority was destined for the flame or the flesh, ensuring their complete disappearance. This curse of the intangible is the final piece of the puzzle. Hatshepsut and her court were driven by a spiritual necessity that transcended material permanence. They sought materials that would perform a spiritual function to transport prayers, to preserve the body, to signal divinity, and those functions, by their very nature, require the material to be consumed. The Punt expeditions were a continuous effort to replenish a resource that was intentionally and ritually destroyed. You can find the ebony chair and the gold necklace, but the specific high-grade nentai resin from Punt, the material that truly mattered to the gods, has quite literally gone up in smoke, remaining a glorious, unlocatable memory carried only on the dry desert wind. You have followed the entire cycle: the divine command, the terrifying voyage, the peaceful exchange, the grueling overland haul, and the glorious parade. You now reach the final quiet moment of reflection on the mystery, a whisper of lost wealth, the enduring mystery of Punt. The tale concludes not with a final discovery, but with the acceptance that the most precious items are often the ones that cannot be held. The mainstream historical fact that defines this enduring mystery is the vibrancy of the reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, which stand in such sharp contrast to the paucity of archaeological evidence. The Egyptians documented the existence of Punt so thoroughly because the trade was critical to their spiritual and political well-being. Yet the materials at the heart of that trade, the scents and perishable goods, are inherently lost to us. This creates a tantalizing gap in the historical record, a massive documented supply chain whose final product literally evaporated. A fringe tidbit is the concept of Punt as a mythical destination. While Hatshepsut's voyages were undeniably real and reached a specific place, the Egyptian mindset treated Punt not just as a location, but as a liminal space, a source of creation and divine essence. The goods from Punte, therefore, carried a mythological premium that inflated their actual material value. The enduring mystery is not just where Punt was, but why the Egyptians afforded it such a unique and sacred status in their cosmology. It was the place of Tenecher, the land of the god, a name that suggests its existence was less about geography and more about divinity. Historians still argue whether the enduring, pervasive myth of Punt was purposefully cultivated by the Egyptian priesthood to justify the extreme costs and efforts of the expeditions. By emphasizing the divine nature of the land and its products, they ensured the continuous allocation of state resources to maintain the supply of incense, regardless of the physical difficulties. You realize that the reason nobody can locate the specific, high-end luxuries today, the superior Antwi resin, the unique electrum, or the unidentified rare woods, is that their value was tethered to their immediacy and their narrative. They were consumed in fire, absorbed into the flesh of the deceased, or melted and reformed into new objects. The only part of the luxury that survived was the story carved in stone for eternity. This final contemplation brings you to a quiet understanding. The most successful luxury items of the ancient world were those that fulfilled the deepest spiritual need, even if that meant their physical form had to vanish. The expeditions to Punt were therefore a massive investment in intangible wealth, a belief system supported by 5 massive wooden ships, thousands of exhausted porters, and the sweet, fading smell of the divine. The heavy, sweet scent of the forgotten resins now seems to fade, replaced by the cool, neutral air of your own room. The echoes of the waves, the shouts of the ancient crews, and the low groaning of the overloaded ships have finally receded into the deep quiet of history. You are no longer on the shores of Punt or standing before the brilliant white walls of Hatshepsut's temple, but suspended in the stillness between two worlds. The mystery remains settled not with a final definite answer, but with the soft assurance that some of history's greatest treasures were never meant to be found in a museum or a treasury, but to be experienced in a moment, to be offered in a plume of fragrant smoke, or to be washed away in the anointing oils of a ritual long forgotten. Let the unanswered questions drift away, just like the smoke of the sacred incense over the Nile Valley 3,000 years ago. All the effort, all the risk, all the wealth expended for the sake of a beautiful temporary fragrance. Sleep now, knowing that the greatest luxury is sometimes simply the mystery itself.